have nowhere else to go, sir. You cannot do this.
The eviction men hurled Thomas Reed's iron stove off the porch, and it split open in the frozen yard with a sound like a rifle shot. Harriet Cole ran toward the tenant cottage as 3 grown laborers dragged chairs, blankets, and flour sacks into the road. Thomas stood beside his wife, Ruth, gripping a folded contract he could not read. Her bare hands were blue from gathering their belongings, and she kept asking whether the paper truly said they had to leave before sundown. Behind the men waited Trustee Silas Vane, clean-gloved and calm, with 6 more eviction notices beneath his arm. And Harriet saw something beside Thomas's signature that no honest agreement would ever need. "Stop," she called. No one did. One of the hired men shouldered past her and carried out the Reed's bed frame. Harriet caught its other end before he could throw it into the mud. She was a thin woman, narrow through the shoulders after years of careful meals and careful silence, but she planted her boots and refused to let go. Vane watched from horseback. "Miss Cole," he said, "you were dismissed for interfering with estate labor. Do not make me remove you from estate land as well." Harriet looked at the contract in Thomas's shaking hand. At the bottom, where his name had been copied in stiff black letters, a small cross had been drawn beside it. Thomas always marked documents with 2 short lines, one upright and one slanting left. Harriet knew because she had helped him sign the mill account the previous spring. This mark slanted right. She reached for the paper. Thomas surrendered it as though it had already condemned him. The first page promised renewal of his traditional tenancy. The second page, written in smaller hand and attached beneath the fold, surrendered his cottage, grazing rights, and winter stores whenever the trustee declared the land commercially necessary. The language had not been misunderstood. It had been hidden. Ruth whispered, "He told us it was the same lease my husband's father held." "It is not," Harriet said. Vane dismounted slowly. "You have no authority to interpret estate contracts." "No," Harriet answered, "but I can read them." For a moment, every hired hand stopped moving. That was the danger Silas Vane had feared. Not Harriet's temper, not her poverty, not even her defiance. He feared one literate woman standing beside people he had kept dependent on his explanations. And perhaps you know how power behaves when someone finally reads the words it hoped would stay hidden. Vane stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Return that document." Harriet folded it once and slipped it inside her coat. Across the road, doors had opened. Adult tenants stood on thresholds and watched in silence. Some held papers identical to Thomas's. Others had already received notices. Vane had not come for one cottage. He had come to empty an entire row before the county court opened its winter session. Harriet turned toward the abandoned kitchen at the far edge of the estate, the cold stone building, where she had been permitted to sleep after losing her position in the manor house. Its roof sagged, its windows were boarded, but it had a door that locked a long work table and shelves wide enough for records. "Carry your papers to the old kitchen," she told the tenants. Vane's expression changed for the first time. "You will leave that building tonight," he said. "Then we have until tonight to learn what you made them sign." A church bell struck once in the distant town. One of Vane's men reached beneath his coat, not for a weapon, but for a leather case filled with more contracts. Harriet saw the names written across their edges. Nearly every tenant on the eastern fields was there. Then hoofbeats rose from the manor road, and the young master of the estate appeared through the bare trees, riding straight toward the cottage where his trustee's deception had finally been read aloud. The young master reined in beside the broken stove and stared at the furniture scattered across the frozen road. Edward Vale was 26, pale from years spent in schools and offices far from the estate, and still wore the dark riding coat of a man who expected doors to open before he reached them. His gaze moved from Thomas Reed's dismantled cottage to Harriet standing with the contract hidden beneath her coat. "What is happening here?" Silas Vane answered first. "A lawful recovery of estate property, sir. Reed defaulted under the tenancy agreement." Thomas lowered his eyes. Ruth held one hand against her husband's sleeve, as though the hired men might take him next. Harriet pulled the contract free and offered it to Edward. "Read the second page." Vane stepped between them. "Miss Cole stole that document from a tenant." Thomas finally looked up. "You go eat it here." The admission was quiet, but it changed the road. Other tenants edged closer. One woman held her own folded agreement against her chest. An older plowman removed a paper from inside his hat. None of them approached Edward. They watched Vane. Edward read the first page standing beside his horse. Then he unfolded the hidden sheet. His mouth tightened. "This language allows removal without compensation. It allows necessary redevelopment," Vane said. "The eastern fields have been losing money for years." Thomas pointed toward the mark beside his copied name. "That ain't mine." Edward studied it. Harriet saw the exact moment he understood that the dispute was not merely about harsh terms. Someone had prepared the paper to resemble consent. Yet he did not accuse Vane. He folded the contract and handed it back to Thomas. "The eviction will stop until I review the records." Vane's voice remained mild. "A delay will weaken every lease on the estate. A forged mark weakens them more." The hired men set down what they were carrying. Vane bowed his head just enough to preserve the appearance of obedience, but his eyes found Harriet. "You have until morning," Edward told her. "Then you leave the old kitchen. Whatever protection my household extended after your dismissal ends here." Harriet accepted the sentence without argument. She had expected less time. By dusk, the abandoned kitchen held 11 adult tenants, 17 contracts, 2 rent ledgers, and every chair the Reeds could salvage from the road. The room had not served a meal in 20 years. Soot blackened the ceiling. One oven door hung crooked. The long oak table had split down its center, and cold air entered through gaps where the window boards had warped. Harriet lit 3 oil lamps, swept mouse droppings from the shelves, and boiled water in a dented copper kettle left beneath the sink. Ruth placed the rescued flour sacks in a dry corner. Thomas repaired one bench with nails pulled from the broken bed frame. Others arrived alone or in pairs, carrying folded papers they had never understood and rent receipts they had saved because they feared being called liars. Harriet laid the documents in rows. "We begin with names," she said. A tenant near the stove gave a nervous laugh. "Names won't keep Vane from the door." "No, but a man cannot defend a paper he cannot identify." She wrote Thomas Reed across a slate in large white letters. Beneath it, she copied the false signature exactly as it appeared on the contract. Thomas stared at the 2 versions. "That says my name?" "Yes." "And the other?" "It is meant to look like your name." He touched the chalked letters with one rough finger. Harriet did not teach them poetry, history, or elegant penmanship. She taught them the words used against them. Rent. Renewal. Notice. Surrender. Eviction. She made each person find those words in their own agreement. When they struggled, she did not answer for them. She guided a finger back to the first letter and waited. The waiting was difficult. These were adults who had plowed frozen ground, delivered livestock in storms, repaired roofs, and buried their pride every time Vane read a paper aloud and told them what it meant. Inside the kitchen, they became hesitant before marks of ink no larger than grain husks. Harriet never called them slow. She divided the table into stations. At one end, Ruth matched rent receipts by year. At the other, Thomas compared the new contract with a faded copy of his father's traditional lease. 2 tenants who recognized numbers checked acreage and payment sums. Those who could not yet read searched for repeated words and seals. Before midnight, the first pattern appeared. Every older lease promised renewal so long as rent and labor obligations were met. Every new contract preserved that promise on the first page, but each contained a second page allowing Vane to terminate the agreement for development, improvement, or estate necessity. The hidden page had been attached only after the tenant's mark was taken. Ruth held her contract close to the lamp. This paper is cleaner along the fold. Harriet examined it. The first page was worn at the corners from months in Ruth's apron pocket. The second remained stiff and pale. It was not folded with the rest, Harriet said. A murmur moved around the table. Thomas found the same difference in his copy. Then another tenant did. Then another. The deception had left a physical line. Harriet drew 2 columns on the slate. What we were told. What the paper says. One by one, the tenants supplied the words. Same lease. Rent unchanged. Only for the estate records. Mark here. Nothing to worry over. Harriet wrote each statement exactly. Then she placed the corresponding contract beneath it. The kitchen became more than shelter. It became a records room built from memory, paper, and people who were beginning to understand that their separate fears belonged to the same design. Near 1 in the morning, a fist struck the outer door. Every conversation stopped. Harriet moved the contracts from the center of the table and slid them into the old bread cupboard. Thomas stood beside the door with a hammer still in his hand. The knock came again. Miss Cole, Edward called. Open the door. Harriet unbarred it. He entered alone, carrying a leather portfolio and a lamp. Snow clung to his shoulders. His eyes took in the crowded benches, the chalk words, and the adults bent over agreements bearing his family's crest. You were told to leave by morning. It is not morning. Edward looked toward the slate. What we were told, he read. No one greeted him. He placed the leather portfolio on the table. Inside were copies of the estate's tenancy register, signed payment schedules, and several notices marked for service before week's end. I took these from Vane's office, he said. Thomas's grip tightened around the hammer. Edward kept both hands visible. I thought they might help. Harriet opened the register. Beside 12 tenant names, Vane had written the same notation, unsuitable for renewal. Yet the rent column showed no arrears. These families paid, she said. Yes. And he prepared removals anyway. Edward looked around the kitchen. The estate owes more than it can presently pay. Vane told me the eastern cottages had to be cleared so the land could be leased to a cattle company. Did he tell you the tenants agreed? Edward did not answer quickly enough. That silence cut deeper than a lie. Harriet closed the register. You signed the redevelopment authority. I signed what I was told would preserve the estate. And did you read it? His face changed. For the first time that night, the tenants saw the sheltered master not as the man whose name stood above theirs, but as another person who had trusted Silas Vane to explain a document. The difference was that Edward's ignorance protected his inheritance. Theirs was taking their homes. A lantern flame passed behind the boarded window. Then another. Thomas blew out the nearest lamp. Outside, boots crossed the frozen ground, and a man's voice announced that the old kitchen would be searched for stolen estate records before dawn. Harriet closed the bread cupboard and rested one hand against its warped wooden door. Outside, lantern light spread through the cracks in the boards. 3 men stood in the yard with Deputy Marsh at their head. Silas Vane waited behind them beneath a dark umbrella, untouched by the sleet. Edward moved toward the entrance. They have no authority to search this building without my permission. Vane's voice came through the door, smooth and patient. The estate register was removed from my office. That makes this a matter of theft. You gave me access to every estate record, Edward called back. I gave you access for review, sir. I did not authorize delivery into the hands of tenants preparing a claim against your property. The people around the table looked at Edward. Vane had chosen his words carefully. Not their homes, not their labor, his property. Harriet lifted the register and returned it to Edward's portfolio. Take this, she said. He did not reach for it. If they find it here, they arrest Thomas or me, Harriet continued. If it remains in your possession, Vane must accuse his master of theft. Edward accepted the portfolio. The deputy struck the door with his fist. Opened by county authority. Harriet removed the bar. When the men entered, she stood aside but did not lower her eyes. Deputy Marsh searched the shelves, the sink, the oven, and the cracked flour bins. He opened the bread cupboard and found only bowls, old pans, and a bundle of kindling. The contracts had disappeared. Ruth sat beside the stove with both hands folded in her lap. Beneath her skirt, tied against the underside of the bench, 17 disputed agreements rested inside a flour cloth. Vane walked slowly around the table. His gaze settled on the slate. Renewal. Surrender. Eviction. You have been holding lessons, he said. I have been reading aloud. To laborers. To tenants. The distinction will not matter when the court hears you encourage them to challenge signed agreements. Harriet took a piece of chalk from the table. They will challenge the agreements themselves. Vane smiled without warmth. Will they? He turned toward Thomas. Mr. Reed, explain the second paragraph on page 2 of your lease. Thomas's face hardened. He knew the word eviction. He knew renewal. But the paragraph held longer terms Harriet had not yet taught him. Vane waited. The room seemed to shrink around the silence. Then Thomas looked at the slate rather than at the trustee. I cannot read all of it yet. Vane glanced toward the deputy, satisfied. Thomas continued, but I can read enough to know you lied when you said it was the same agreement my father held. The satisfaction left Vane's face. Ruth untied the flour cloth and placed her contract on the table. And I know this page was added after I made my mark. Another tenant produced a rent receipt. I know this says paid. A woman near the cold oven raised her agreement. And this says surrender. The words came slowly. Some were mispronounced. Some had to be traced with a finger. But each word belonged to the person speaking it. Vane looked at Edward. This is insubordination dressed as education. No, Harriet said. It is evidence spoken by the people who signed. Deputy Marsh shifted near the door. Mr. Vane, unless you can identify stolen property, I have no grounds to take anyone. Vane studied him. The deputy's eyes dropped. Harriet saw fear pass between them. Vane did not need to threaten men loudly. He held mortgages, recommendations, wages, and debts. His power lived inside favors people could not afford to lose. Search their persons, Vane said. Edward stepped between the deputy and the tenants. No. Vane's expression remained polite. Sir, these people are concealing estate papers. They are holding their own contracts. The contracts belong to the estate. Harriet raised one of the copies. Then why were they issued to the tenants? Vane did not answer her. Edward's voice grew firmer. The search is finished. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Vane bowed. As you wish, but by noon tomorrow, I will file notice that Miss Cole has unlawfully occupied estate property, interfered with contractual enforcement, and coached witnesses in preparation for fraudulent testimony. He turned toward the tenants. Anyone found here after tonight will be listed as refusing lawful instruction. Their employment will end immediately. A laborer near the wall looked toward the door. His wife depended on his wages. Another man covered his contract with one hand, as though the paper might betray him merely by being seen. Vane had not come to seize the evidence. He had come to make courage expensive. Before leaving, he paused beside Harriet. You are teaching them enough to become frightened, he said softly. Not enough to win. Harriet met his eyes. Then I will teach faster. When the yard fell dark again, for tenants left, no one condemned them. Harriet watched their lanterns move toward the eastern cottages. Fear had families, debts, and empty cupboards. It could not be shamed out of a person. Thomas began to gather the slates. So that is done, he said. No, Harriet replied. Now the school becomes quieter. They moved the lessons to smaller groups. 2 tenants came before dawn. 3 arrived during the midday meal break. Others brought contracts hidden in grain sacks, tool chests, and bundles of laundry. Harriet changed what she taught. The court would not care whether they could read every word. It would care whether they understood what they were promised, when they made their marks, and whether pages had been altered afterward. She taught them to identify dates, to compare amounts, to recognize the estate seal, to distinguish a witness line from a signature line, to say, clearly and without ornament, that page was not present when I signed. The tenants practiced giving testimony to one another. Harriet sat at the head of the table and played Vane's attorney. Did you read the contract before marking it? No. Then how do you know what it contained? Mr. Vane read the first page aloud. Can you prove that? My wife heard him. What if your wife is mistaken? She remembers the words he used. What words? He said, same lease, same rent, same rights. Again and again, Harriet forced them to answer only what they knew. No guessing. No speeches. No repeating what another tenant had said. Truth had to remain plain enough to survive cross-examination. Edward returned on the 3rd night carrying older ledgers from the manor archive. He had not slept well. His collar was unfastened, and there was ink along one cuff. I found the original tenancy book, he said. Harriet opened it beneath the lamps. The older agreements were recorded in a steady hand. Each tenant family had renewal rights tied to rent, maintenance, and labor. In a later section, written after Edward inherited the property, Vane had inserted references to revised contracts. Beside the revisions stood Edward's signature. Thomas looked at him. Edward did not turn away. I signed the authorization, he said. Vane told me the changes would attract investment and prevent foreclosure. Did you read the tenant contracts? Harriet asked. No. Did you ask who would be removed? No. The answers cost him something. Ruth placed a rent receipt beside the ledger. You preserved the house by signing away ours. Edward lowered his gaze. Yes. No one offered him comfort. Harriet continued turning pages until she found a series of ink entries squeezed into a margin. Payments from a cattle syndicate had been received months before the revised contracts were supposedly negotiated. Vane had promised the eastern land before the tenants ever placed their marks on the papers. This proves intent, Harriet said. He did not change the leases because the estate later needed the land. He had already sold access to it. Edward read the sums twice. They paid deposits. And where is the money? Thomas asked. The estate accounts showed only half of it. The rest had passed through a private holding account controlled by Vane. The room went still. Now the trustee's purpose was simple enough for every person there to understand. Silas Vane meant to clear paying tenants from valuable grazing land, conceal part of the syndicate money, and leave Edward believing the evictions were the price of saving his inheritance. Harriet copied the relevant dates onto the slate. Deposit received. Contracts revised. Tenant marks collected. Eviction notices prepared. The order destroyed Vane's claim that the new terms had been necessary responses to later financial trouble. Edward stood beside the stove. If I submit this, the court will ask why I approved the revisions. Yes, Harriet said. They may rule that I was negligent. Yes. The syndicate may withdraw. Creditors may move against the estate. Yes. He looked toward the adults seated around the table. And if I do nothing? Thomas answered him. You keep your house by helping Vane take ours. Edward closed the ledger. That night, he signed a statement declaring that he had never instructed Vane to conceal pages, misrepresent terms, or obtain marks under false explanations. It was not absolution. It was a beginning. The next problem was getting the evidence to county court. The hearing was set for Monday morning. Vane controlled the estate wagons. and Deputy Marsh could delay any group he claimed was disturbing the peace. Worse, several original contracts remained locked in Vane's office. The tenants held copies, but Vane could argue they had been altered. They needed one original document. Ruth remembered that Vane had kept Thomas's contract after collecting his mark, then returned a copy 2 weeks later. Thomas remembered seeing a stack of folded papers tied with green cord inside the office safe. Edward knew the combination. At dawn, he and Harriet entered the trustee's office through the manor corridor. Edward opened the safe while Harriet watched the courtyard. Inside were debt papers, sealed letters, syndicate agreements, and 32 original tenant contracts. Every one bore a hidden second page. Harriet compared Thomas's original with his copy. The copied signature matched. The cross did not. On the original, Thomas's true left slanting mark had been carefully scraped away. A false right slanting cross had been drawn over the damaged paper. Harriet held it toward the window. The fibers were rough where the knife had lifted the ink. This is the contradiction the court can see. A floorboard creaked behind them. Deputy Marsh stood in the doorway. His hand rested near his revolver, but he did not draw it. Vane appeared over his shoulder. The trustee looked at the open safe, the contracts on the desk, and Edward holding the syndicate ledger. "I had hoped," Vane said quietly, "that gratitude would make you wiser than your father." Edward's face went pale. "You forged their marks. I prevented your estate from collapsing. You stole part of the payment. I took what I was owed for preserving a name you were too sheltered to carry." Deputy Marsh took one step into the room. Vane nodded toward Harriet. "Arrest her for theft. Take the documents. The master is distressed and being influenced by a dismissed servant." Marsh looked at Vane, then at Edward, then at the scraped mark on Thomas's contract. His mouth opened, but no words came. Vane's voice lowered. "Deputy, your mortgage is due next month." Marsh's hand trembled. For one terrible moment, Harriet believed he would obey. Instead, Edward seized the original contract and moved toward the window. Vane lunged for him. The oil lamp struck the desk, fell sideways, and shattered among the papers. Flame ran across the syndicate ledger. Harriet dragged the burning book to the floor and smothered it beneath Vane's wool coat. Smoke filled the office. Deputy Marsh pulled Edward away from the desk while Vane reached into the safe and began throwing contracts into the fire. Harriet caught his wrist. She could not overpower him. She did not need to. She shouted through the open window, "Bring the tenants!" Voices rose from the courtyard. Thomas and Ruth had been waiting beyond the kitchen garden with 6 others, ready to carry the evidence once Edward secured it. They ran toward the office as smoke poured through the window. Vane tore free and kicked the burning papers beneath the desk. By the time the tenants reached the corridor, the safe was open, the room was choking with smoke, and Deputy Marsh stood between Silas Vane and the only surviving bundle of original contracts. The deputy looked once more at the man who owned his debt. Then he placed the bundle in Ruth's hands. "Take them to court," he said. Outside, the manor bell began to ring, and across the estate road, hired riders were already gathering to stop the witnesses before Monday morning. The first wagon left before sunrise with Ruth holding the surviving contracts beneath her coat, and Thomas walking beside the rear wheel with a splitting maul across his shoulder. Harriet rode inside with the tenants who had agreed to testify. Edward sat on the bench beside the driver, carrying the scorched syndicate ledger in a metal document box. Deputy Marsh followed on horseback, close enough to appear protective and far enough to show he had not yet decided how much courage he could afford. They took the mill road instead of the estate lane. It was longer, but Harriet knew Vane's hired riders would expect them at the south gate. The wagon moved between dark hedges and frozen fields while every witness silently rehearsed the same 3 truths. What were you told? What did you mark? What page was missing? Harriet had warned them not to improve their memories for the sake of the court. A mistake honestly admitted could survive. A perfect story repeated by 6 frightened people would look coached. Ruth kept one hand beneath her coat. Thomas noticed. "You still got them?" "Yes." "You reckon you ought to give them to the deputy?" Ruth looked back at Marsh. "No." No one argued. Halfway to the river bridge, hoofbeats rose behind them. The driver cracked the reins. The wagon lurched over ruts hardened by frost. Harriet looked through the rear opening and counted 4 riders, then 2 more emerging from the tree line. Vane had not come himself. He had sent men who could later be called concerned employees protecting stolen property. "Do not stop," Edward told the driver. One rider drew alongside the wagon. "County order," he shouted. "Pull over." Marsh spurred forward. "There is no county order." The man held up a folded paper bearing a red seal. For one dangerous second, the driver slowed. Harriet leaned toward Edward. "Tell him what the seal says." Edward stood against the swaying wagon and read the heading. "Estate Recovery Notice. Signed by Silas Vane. It has no county authority." The rider folded the paper away. Then he reached for the reins. Thomas struck the man's wrist with the flat of the maul handle. The rider lost his grip, but stayed in the saddle. Another man crowded the wagon from the opposite side and caught the canvas cover, tearing it loose. Cold air flooded the passengers. The tenants did not scatter. 2 held the document box against the floor. Another braced Ruth as the wagon struck a stone. Harriet crawled toward the rear step and saw the mill bridge ahead, a narrow wooden crossing above black winter water. One of Vane's men galloped past and turned his horse sideways across the bridge. The driver pulled hard. The wagon skidded. A rear wheel dropped into a roadside ditch, throwing everyone against one side. The document box slammed open. Singed ledger pages spilled across the boards. Harriet grabbed 3. Edward caught 2 more. One page blew out through the torn canvas and landed in the mud beneath a rider's horse. The rider leaned down to seize it. Deputy Marsh drew his revolver. Every man froze. Marsh's arm shook so badly the barrel traced a small circle in the air. "Step away from the paper," he said. The rider smiled. "You planning to shoot a man over bookkeeping?" Marsh looked toward the bridge, where another hired man blocked the road. Then he looked at Ruth holding the contracts and at Harriet kneeling among burned pages. "No," he said. "I am planning to arrest anyone who interferes with witnesses bound for county court." The hired men laughed. They knew Marsh's position could disappear with one word from Vane. Then Thomas climbed out of the wagon. He did not raise the maul. He walked into the road and stood beside the deputy. Ruth followed, still carrying the contracts. One by one, the other tenants stepped down. The riders had expected frightened laborers protecting papers they could not understand. Instead, they faced adults who had learned exactly why those papers mattered. Edward walked toward the man blocking the bridge. "That wagon crosses. Mr. Vane says these documents are estate property." Edward held up the scorched ledger page. "I am the estate owner." The man's expression changed, but he did not move. Edward lowered the paper. "And I am also a witness against my trustee." That cost more than defiance. Everyone there understood it. He had tied his own name to the case and could no longer claim ignorance if the estate fell. The rider at the bridge finally turned his horse aside. No shots were fired. The wagon wheel was levered from the ditch with fence posts. Mud covered the rescued ledger page, but Harriet laid it between 2 boards inside the wagon and pressed it flat. The ink had run along one edge. The dates and deposit amounts remained visible. They reached the courthouse just after the bell began to ring. Silas Vane was already there. He stood beneath the stone arch in a black coat, speaking with his attorney and 2 cattle syndicate representatives. Behind them waited a wagon containing fresh record books recovered from the manor office. Vane had brought clean evidence. Harriet had brought burned pages, frightened witnesses, altered contracts, and the truth. The courtroom filled before the judge entered. Tenants crowded the rear benches. Estate employees stood along the walls. Townspeople who had spent years asking Vane for loans, wages, and recommendations kept their hats in their hands and their eyes lowered. Judge Alden called the hearing to order. Vane's attorney rose first. He described the dispute as a lawful effort to rescue a failing estate from insolvency. He presented Edward's signed redevelopment authority, the new contracts, and a statement from the cattle syndicate confirming that their investment depended upon vacant possession of the eastern fields. Then he turned toward the tenants. These agreements bear their marks. They received copies. They remained on estate land under the revised terms. Only after Miss Cole's dismissal did they claim deception. The argument was simple and strong. The documents looked official. The signatures appeared complete. And Harriet was easy to portray as a resentful servant teaching people what to say. The attorney called Vane. The trustee spoke without anger. He admitted revising the leases. He denied hiding any page. He claimed every tenant had been told the land might be required for commercial use. He explained the missing syndicate money as administrative fees and emergency payments made on behalf of the estate. "Did you forge any mark?" the attorney asked. "No." "Did you deceive any tenant?" "No." "Did you profit beyond authorized compensation?" "No." Vane looked toward Edward. "I did what was necessary to preserve the inheritance entrusted to me." For a moment, even Harriet understood why people had believed him. He made theft sound like stewardship and obedience sound like wisdom. Edward was called next. He admitted signing the authority without reading every attached provision. Vane's attorney made him repeat it. "You approve the redevelopment?" "Yes." "You knew tenants might be removed?" "I knew some land might be reorganized." "You did not object until Miss Cole gathered these tenants?" "No." "You now seek to blame your trustee for an agreement you signed?" Edward's face reddened. "I seek to expose what he concealed. But you cannot prove what he told each tenant." "No." "And if this development fails, your estate may collapse?" "Yes." The attorney turned toward the judge. "The owner regrets a difficult decision. Regret is not fraud." The first tenant witness was Thomas. He walked to the stand with the stiff caution of a man entering ground where every word could be used against him. Harriet had told him to look at the judge, not at Vane. He tried. The clerk placed Thomas's contract before him. "Can you read this document?" Vane's attorney asked. "Some of it." "Could you read it when you marked it?" "No." "So you relied upon Mr. Vane?" "Yes." "And now you rely upon Miss Cole?" Thomas looked toward Harriet. The attorney smiled slightly. "Did she not teach you the words you have repeated today?" "She taught me what the words say." "Did she tell you that you had been deceived?" "She showed me the second page." "Answer yes or no." Thomas's hands closed around the witness rail. "Yes." The attorney faced the judge. A coached conclusion from a man who admits he cannot read the full document. Thomas's breathing changed. Harriet saw him begin to lose the careful order of his answers. Then Ruth spoke from the bench. "Tell him about the foal." The judge looked at her. "You will wait until called, ma'am." Thomas stared at the contract. The second page was new. "How could you know that if you never read it?" "The first page lived in my coat for 2 weeks. It bent where I folded it. The second did not." The attorney lifted both sheets. "Paper can wear differently." "Yes." "So that proves nothing." Thomas looked toward the judge at last. "It proves they were not together when I carried them home." The room became quieter. Not silent enough to win, but quieter. Ruth testified next. She repeated Vane's exact words. Same lease, same rent, same rights. The attorney asked whether Harriet had helped her remember. Harriet helped me put the words in order, Ruth said. Mr. Vane put them in my memory. The tenants followed. Some forgot dates. One confused renewal with surrender and had to correct himself. Another admitted he had never asked for a full reading because he feared losing work. Their testimony was imperfect. That made it harder to dismiss. Yet the judge kept returning to the same problem. The contracts bore marks. The estate seal was authentic. Edward had approved redevelopment. Harriet's witnesses could prove what they remembered, but not who altered the papers. The original contracts were introduced. Harriet showed the scraped fibers beneath Thomas's false cross. Vane's attorney objected that the damage could have occurred in the kitchen after the tenants took possession of the documents. Judge Alden examined the mark beneath a magnifying lens. It is suspicious, he said, but suspicion does not establish who made the alteration. Vane did not smile. He did not need to. The case was slipping toward him. Then Harriet offered the scorched syndicate ledger. The attorney objected again. The chain of custody is compromised. The book was removed from estate offices, damaged in a fire, carried in an unsecured wagon, and handled by multiple interested parties. Judge Alden opened the metal box and studied the burned pages. Several entries were unreadable. One deposit line had been smeared by mud. Another page had lost the name of the receiving account entirely. The clearest entry showed that the syndicate paid money before the revised contracts were dated. Vane's attorney rose. Advanced negotiations are not evidence of fraud. An estate may seek investment before finalizing tenancy changes. The judge nodded. Harriet felt the room shift. The most important proof had survived the fire, yet it was no longer enough by itself. Vane's attorney moved for dismissal of the fraud claim and enforcement of the eviction notices. Judge Alden looked toward the tenants, then toward Edward, then toward Vane. I am prepared to rule on the documents presently before me. Thomas lowered his head. Ruth pressed both hands against the bench. Deputy Marsh stood near the back wall, pale and motionless. Harriet realized he had not been called. She rose. Your Honor, the deputy witnessed Mr. Vane attempting to destroy the original contracts. Vane's attorney turned sharply. Miss Cole is not licensed to address the court. Judge Alden studied Harriet. Sit down. She remained standing for one breath longer. Then Marsh spoke. She is right. Every face turned toward him. Vane looked back slowly. The deputy approached the witness stand, but stopped before reaching it. His mouth had gone dry. He glanced at Vane, and the trustee gave the smallest shake of his head. It was not a threat anyone else would have noticed. Marsh noticed. His home stood on land mortgaged through an account Vane controlled. His position depended upon estate support. One sentence could cost him both. Judge Alden waited. Deputy. Marsh looked toward the door. Harriet believed he might leave. Then he saw Ruth holding Thomas's contract against her chest, guarding a document she had once been unable to read. Marsh stepped into the witness box. Under oath, he admitted entering the trustee's office. He admitted seeing the safe open. He admitted seeing Vane throw papers toward the fallen lamp. Vane's attorney approached. Was the room filled with smoke? Yes. Were several people struggling? Yes. Could you clearly identify what Mr. Vane held? Marsh hesitated. Vane watched him. The deputy's voice nearly failed. Then he said, tenant contracts tied with green cord. A murmur moved through the court. The attorney stopped. Judge Alden leaned forward. Why were you carrying them? Marsh looked once more at Vane. He told me they needed new witness marks. The courtroom went still. Harriet felt Thomas turn beside her. Judge Alden's voice sharpened. Explain. Marsh swallowed. The tenant marks were already there. Mr. Vane had me take the contracts to his private office. Later, I saw that some marks looked different. I asked no questions. Did you witness him alter them? No, sir. The attorney seized upon it. So you cannot testify that Mr. Vane forged anything? No. Vane's control had cracked, but it had not broken. Then the clerk brought Thomas's original contract back to the stand. Marsh stared at the right slanting cross. That is the mark I saw after, Judge Alden asked. And before? Marsh pointed toward the scraped fibers beneath it. The first mark slanted left. Thomas lifted his hand from the rail. With one finger, he traced his usual cross in the air. Upright. Then left. The simplest motion in the courtroom destroyed the largest lie. Judge Alden ordered the remaining contracts examined. 8 showed scraped or overwritten marks. For contained witness signatures dated before the second pages had been printed. On 2, the estate seal had been pressed over folds that did not align, proving the pages were assembled separately. The clerk then compared the dates with the syndicate ledger. The first deposit had arrived 6 weeks before Vane claimed negotiations began. The second had gone into his private account. By afternoon, the court had enough. Judge Alden voided the revised tenancy contracts. He suspended every eviction notice and restored the traditional leases pending full accounting. He ordered the disputed syndicate funds frozen and referred Silas Vane for prosecution on fraud, forgery, destruction of records, and theft from the estate. Vane stood as the deputy approached him. For the first time, his polished calm disappeared. "You think these people can preserve this land?" he asked Edward. "They will ruin you." Edward looked at the tenants filling the benches. "Then I will be ruined by the truth." Marsh placed a hand on Vane's arm. The trustee did not resist. Outside, the tenants gathered on the courthouse steps with their contracts returned to them. Thomas read the word renewal without help. Ruth read paid on an old receipt and began to laugh, not loudly, but with the stunned relief of a person hearing her own life spoken correctly. Harriet stood apart near the stone railing. Edward approached with a court order in his hand. "The old kitchen will remain open," he said. "As what?" He looked toward the tenants comparing papers in the afternoon light. "As whatever they decide it should become." The victory did not erase the estate's debt. It did not repair the broken stove or return wages lost during the hearing. It did not teach every tenant to read before nightfall. But when the courthouse doors closed behind Silas Vane, the people he had deceived were no longer waiting for someone else to explain what justice said. The broken iron stove was the first thing Thomas Reed carried back into the old kitchen. Its door no longer closed properly, and one side had split when the eviction men threw it into the frozen yard. Thomas could not make it beautiful again. He could only straighten the hinges, patch the crack with an iron plate, and set the stove upon new bricks where everyone could see what had nearly been taken from them. By the next winter, that stove warmed 3 evening classes each week. The county court had restored the traditional leases, but the victory left difficult work behind. Silas Vane's private accounts had hidden debts the estate still owed. The cattle syndicate withdrew its investment. Creditors demanded payment. Several roofs required repair. And the eastern fields had lost a planting season, while everyone waited to learn whether they would still have homes. Edward Vale did not solve those troubles by offering charity from the manor. He opened the estate books. Every rent payment, supply expense, repair cost, and creditor demand was copied into plain language and posted in the old kitchen. Tenants elected 3 adults to review the accounts each month. No new contract could take effect until it had been read aloud, discussed publicly, and copied for every person expected to sign it. Edward surrendered the authority his family had always treated as private. The estate survived more slowly than Vane had promised, but it survived honestly. Harriet remained in the narrow room beside the kitchen at first. She kept her few dresses on wall pegs, her teaching slates beneath the bed, and Thomas's original contract locked in a small wooden chest. Edward offered her rooms in the manor twice. She refused twice. The old kitchen needed someone to light the lamps before laborers arrived, and someone to keep the kettle warm after they left. More than that, Harriet did not yet trust comfort that could be withdrawn by the person who provided it. Each night, before sleeping, she checked the outer door. Then she checked the bread cupboard. Then the window boards. Even after Vane was convicted, hoofbeats on the estate road could still make her stop speaking. Once, when Deputy Marsh came after dark to deliver copies of the final judgment, Harriet hid the tenancy register beneath her mattress before opening the door. She knew it was foolish. Her hands did it anyway. Fear did not leave merely because a judge told it the danger was over. Ruth understood. For months after the hearing, she carried every receipt inside her dress and unfolded them whenever she woke during the night. Thomas began reading the figures to her, though she already knew what they said. The ritual mattered more than the information. Paid. Renewed. Recorded. Little by little, the words became ordinary. The night school grew. Harriet taught contracts first because contracts could take a house. Then came wage books, seed invoices, loan notices, and letters from absent relatives. Adults who once placed crosses beside sentences they did not understand began writing their own names. Those who learned quickly sat beside those just beginning, tracing letters in flowers scattered across the long oak table. No one was permitted to laugh at a mistake. Harriet had only one punishment for mockery. The offender had to sit beside the learner and help until the word was understood. Deputy Marsh attended in secret for 6 weeks before anyone mentioned it. He could read common notices, but had never understood the mortgage papers Vane used to control him. When Harriet showed him the interest clause, he discovered that the debt should have been paid years earlier. The county clerk later voided the false balance. Marsh kept his home. He also resigned as deputy and accepted work maintaining the public records office, where he insisted that every mark made by a person unable to read be witnessed by 2 independent adults. Edward learned beside the tenants, though not from the same lessons. He learned to ask questions before signing. He learned that confession did not erase consequence. He sold 2 hunting parcels and most of the manors and used silver to pay estate creditors without removing a single tenant. He moved his office from the upper floor of the manor to the room adjoining the old kitchen, where anyone could knock without first passing a servant or requesting permission. For a long time, no one did. Then Thomas came with a drainage proposal written in his own hand. Edward read it. Thomas waited. Edward asked what it would cost and who would maintain it. Thomas answered. The drainage channel was built that spring. Years passed before Harriet agreed to move into larger rooms, and even then, she chose the small cottage facing the kitchen rather than a grand chamber in the manor. Edward carried her wooden chest there himself. When he set it beside the hearth, he noticed Thomas's contract still inside. You do not need to hide that anymore, he said. I know, but she kept it. Not as evidence, as memory. Their affection grew without rescue in it. Edward did not offer Harriet security in exchange for silence, and Harriet did not forgive him by pretending his ignorance had been harmless. They worked beside one another until trust became less like a promise and more like a habit. When they eventually married, the ceremony took place in the old kitchen beneath the soot-darkened beams. Thomas and Ruth signed the register as witnesses. Thomas wrote every letter of his name. The cracked stove stood warm behind them. Harriet continued teaching after marriage. The kitchen remained governed by the tenants' elected committee, not by the manor household. Edward placed the building and its records under a permanent community trust, so no future owner could close the school, seize its papers, or use the room as a private office. By the time Harriet's hair turned gray, adults from neighboring estates traveled miles to attend her contract nights. Some came to learn a signature. Others came carrying agreements they already suspected were dishonest. Harriet never told them what choice to make. She showed them where the obligations stood, where the penalties hid. where a promise on the first page could be undone by one sentence on the second. Then she made them read the sentence themselves. Thomas eventually became one of the school's instructors. Ruth kept the receipt archive and could find 20 years of payments faster than any county clerk. Above the bread cupboard, they hung the first slate Harriet had used. What we were told. What the paper says. The letters faded, but no one erased them. On winter evenings, Harriet still sometimes paused when hooves sounded outside. Edward would notice, place another piece of wood into the stove, and continue whatever account they had been reviewing. He did not tell her there was nothing to fear. He simply remained until the sound passed. And each time, fear held the room for a little less time than before. The kitchen door that Silas Vane once threatened to close was left unlocked during lesson hours. Beside it stood a shelf where anyone could place a contract, receipt, or notice they needed help understanding. The repaired stove continued to burn at the center of the room. It had once been thrown from a tenant's home to prove that written power could scatter a life into the road. Years later, it warmed a room full of people no longer willing to sign away what they could finally read. If this story reminded you that knowledge can protect a home as surely as any locked door, read the second page in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe for more frontier stories where ordinary people learn to stand before power in their own names.